Good day. My name is Robert Furlan. You are currently sitting so you can hear a lecture on Philippine history. It's a brief overview. It takes about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes. You have all of this in writing in the reviewer, my reviewer. It's on page 132. Now, the benefits of having a lecture compared to just reading what's in a reviewer is we get to discuss verbally the main events in your history. So, reading is one component of learning, but listening is also another component of learning. And when you will do practice exams, wherever that's going to be in a boarding house or a review center, all our practice exams will put um, will be very demanding on your brain because you would have read the reviewer, you would have listened to what I have to say, but when you do the exam, you also have to do research. Because you did three things: you read, you listen, and now you research. Your chances of recalling information at the exam are extremely high. If you only read, your chances are still there, but it's not as strong. So it is a brief overview. It is not exhaustive. It does not include everything. It gives you the essential. When you do the practice exams, many questions that would be asked, the answers are not in the reviewer. Otherwise, the reviewer would be 1,000 pages thick. So practice exam are what's going to help you most. The reviewer is something to build your foundation for learning. Okay, so let's start on page 132. Some things I will go very fast and some things I would stop. Okay, the reason I stop is I have all the LET exams since 2010 in general education and professional education and social studies majorship. So I pretty much well know what's usually being asked at the exam. Although it's not precise, it gives me a very good general idea. So history of the Philippines and overview. You started trading with the Chinese in the 10th century, around year 1000. They dominated Philippine commerce from then on. So your main transactions come from China if you start in the year 1000. One of the things that you should know is that all Asians, wherever they are in Asia, all Asians, the main source comes from Mongolia. Mongolia is northern China. Um, it is its own country. They had the greatest fighter of all time, the greatest warrior called Genghis Khan. Um, that's why some babies, Filipino babies or Asian babies, when they are born or later in life, they have sort of a dark patch on their body, like a birthmark. It's actually called a mongoloid patch. You all have that because you are Asians. I'm Caucasian, so we have other attributes. So you started trading with the Chinese in year 1000. Around the year 1300, the Muslims came, the Arabs came, and they preach Islam in Sulu, and that's why you have Muslims in Mindanao right now. In 1521, Ferdinand Magellan landed in the Philippines. It marked the beginning of the interest in the Philippines as several Spanish expeditions follow. So this point you have to remember. It's almost always at the exam. Not all the time, but generally speaking, it is there. So if we go here, you traded, dominated, and then we go arrival of Magellan in 1521. You have to remember that. Now, where did Magellan come? Where did he land his ships? Well, there are several answers. The real answer, it's rarely asked at the exam. It's a place called Omonhon. Homonhon. Most of the times people will say Cebu. And that's the question at the exam. Where did Magellan go first? It's in Cebu. If you see Cebu, that's what you answer. Any other answers are distractors. Sometimes they will put Manila, they will put Mactan, they will put Aklan, they will put Legazpi. The answer is Cebu. If you see Omanhon, that's the real place. That's the one you need to check. The first mass in the Philippines was March 31, 1521. It was held in Limasawa. It's in Leyte. And that's when you started converting from shamanism to Roman Catholicism, which is very prevalent right now in the Philippines. In April 27, 1521, death of Magellan at the hand of Lapu-Lapu, we all know that. Um, they rarely ask about the death or who killed him. And then landing of Miguel Lopez de Legazpi in Cebu in 1565. It is the beginning of the Spanish dominance in the Philippines, as Legazpi later established the seat of Spanish government in Manila. So really, Magellan said, well, this is where the Philippines is, but the real administrator, the real one who established the Spanish colonies is Legazpi. Um, there's a blood compact in 1565. Spanish Captain General Legazpi and Raja Sikatuna performed the blood compact in Bohol as a sign of peace agreement between their parties. Um, First agreement for peace in the Philippines on June 4, 1565. That's really, really asked. The next point is construction of the church and convent of Santo Niño, the first Roman Catholic church in the Philippines, in Cebu by Reverend Father Andres de Urdaneta in 1565. Now that you have to know. That's oftentimes at the exam. Um, what I would recommend is when I say these questions come at the exam, I would recommend you highlight, you underline, you put a check mark. This is stuff that you need to know. I'm not asking you to remember, I'm asking you to know. If I say to you what happened in 1521 in the Philippines, you need to be able to say, oh, Magellan came and Legazpi came, and next page. Shipbuilding in the early 1600s. The ship were built in Bilaran Island, later in Cavite. I've seen one question on this in the last 12 years, so it's not frequently asked. The next one is almost always at the exam. The longest revolt in history. It's not in history, it's in Philippines history. From 1744 to 1829, Francisco Dagohoy led the longest uprising in Bohol against the Spanish government. The Dagohoy revolt, you need to know that. British invasion. So you thought you were always conquered by Spaniards, which is not true. The British also conquered, invaded the Philippines in September 1762. They occupied Manila for 2 years, and that was during the Seven-Year War in Europe. The Seven-Year War was mostly between France and England. This is how Canada actually, Canada was first established by the French. And during the Seven-Year War, Britain came here and conquered Canada, but they kept us speaking French. So there's a province in Canada called Quebec, and that comes from 500 years ago when it was populated by French colonies. Let me turn my page here. Like you see, I'm going very fast, so I expect you to reread that portion of your reviewer. You need the points in social studies. You need the points in gen ed, okay? For the ones that are in elementary education, this is 40% of your exam. So please study history very, very good. In the tobacco monopoly in 1781, the Spanish government established this for business purposes. It served as a big source of revenue for the Spanish government until it was closed in 1882. During the period, tobacco farms and cigarette plants in the country increased and employed many Filipinos as farmers and factory workers. So Filipinos by nature, because you practice shamanism before the Spaniards came, you smoked a lot, just like we did here in Canada when I was young. You smoked a lot, and then the Spaniards came in and said you could not buy or sell tobacco without paying a tax to the Spanish government. So they had basically a monopoly. Only the Spaniards could buy tobacco, and then they would resell it to you. So your own product that you planted, that you harvest, you had to sell it to the Spaniards, and in order to use it, you had to buy it from them. Surnames for Filipinos. In November 1849, Governor Narciso Claveria y Zaldúa issued a decree that provided for the use of Spanish surnames by Filipinos to facilitate census, tax collection, and administration. This is a little bit of a falsehood. The reason they wanted you to have Spanish name is from being dominated to actually being conquered. Being conquered is removing your identity. So you lost your traditional names to adopt Spanish names. Like my wife's name is Descalzo, totally Spanish. It's very unfortunate, but it's true, and it is oftentimes at the exam. So either the year or under which governor were the names changed. Um, you have to remember that. La Cofradia de San Jose, 1832-1841, it was founded as a religious cult. I wouldn't pay too much attention to this. I've never seen this at the exam. There's a quarantine station in 1850. The Spanish government established the Larazeto de Mariveles in Batayan as a way of checking and sanitizing passengers and cargoes of foreign ships from contagious disease before they could enter Manila. The Americans continued this practice in 1902 by establishing quarantine services in ports of entry. One thing that I want to attract your attention, the last paragraph, quarantine station 1850. And it's true, the Spaniards did this. The history of the Philippines is a little bit tricky, okay? Um, I'm not Filipino. I'm not putting your culture down. I'm not putting your country down. I'm just telling you, I've been reviewing the Philippines since I'm with my wife, 1990. That's 32 years, and I learned a lot. I'm an avid reader. So basically, what this paragraph says is in 1850, you were under Spanish rules, and there was a quarantine station in Bataan. But your history says that in 1898 you became independent. It's not exactly true. You were not independent in 1898. Actually, the Americans kicked the Spaniards out and they signed the Treaty of Paris, and you were sold for $20 million US. So the Americans paid Spain $20 million to have you um, as a conquered country by the Americans. And the proof of that is this paragraph says that in 1902, the Americans kept the practice. So the Americans were there. They were the ones managing. To say that you were independent is not true. What Aguinaldo said in 1898 was he was the first to say that Philippines should be independent. And he did some pushing back against the Spaniards. He tried to do some pushbacks against the Americans. They caught him. They sent him to Macau. He came back later and he kept quiet. So your independence did not really happen in 1898, and you will learn that as we go. Your real independence is in 1946, actually July 4, 1946. Don't put that in your notes. It's rarely at the exam, but if you want to put it, it's a good idea. The sugar industry in the Philippines in 1859, Nicholas Loney is from England, pioneered the sugar industry that contributed to the growth of Iloilo and Panay. So the sugar cane. The Cavite Mutiny, January 20, 1872. Sergeant Lamadrid led artillery regiments and some naval crews in capturing the arsenal of Fort San Felipe in Cavite. The event was local in scope and easily quelled, but Spanish priests used it to implicate their enemies in the clergy, resulting in the execution of Fathers Mariano Gomez, Jose Burgos, and Jacinto Zamora. So the Gomburza, that is often at the exam. Please study this paragraph. I want to attract your attention here. The Spanish priests used it to implicate their enemies and the clergy. I thought that priests were supposed to be practicing forgiveness. They're supposed to be generous, benevolent, philanthropists. No, that's not it. Actually, the Spanish clergy owned property in the Philippines. Actually, most of the land was owned by the church in the Philippines. They had three Filipino clergymen, priests, executed. Gomburza, you need to know that. Gomburza, 1872, and what are their names? Father Gomez, Father Burgos, and Father Zamora. This is not always at the exam. I see it every either March or September exam is going to be in. It's not in both in the same year, but if I was you, I would retain it. Telephone system in 1890, you can read it. It's PLDT. It is a monopoly. So landlines in the Philippines is one company, it's PLDT. Now with cell phones, it's less important, but it's still PLDT. Establishment of Masonic Lodge, you can read it. I've never seen a question about this, but you have to study your own history. The other one, execution of Burgos, Gomez, and Zamora, Gomburza, on February 17, 1872. The three priests known in history as Gomburza were garroted by the Spaniards in connection with the Cavite mutiny. If you don't know what is garroted, they would put a rope around your neck, and at the back they had a stick, and they would start turning the stick, and slowly they would strangle you. It was a slow, painful death. It was done in public, so in front of people. It was also practiced in Europe, in France, in Italy, Spain, Portugal, so all the Latino countries. So this you need to know, when were they executed. The next one you also need to know, founding of the La Solidaridad. In 1889, the Filipino propagandists in Spain established this as the organ of the propaganda movement. Graciano Lopez Huayna and Marcelo del Pilar serve as editors. You have to know their names. Lopez Huayna and Marcelo del Pilar serve as editors. Remember this for La Solidaridad. It published essays and articles in Spanish expressing the Filipino demands for reform in the Philippines. One of the writers was Jose Rizal. You have to remember that. That's oftentimes at the exam. I will get to that as we go along. Construction of the Manila-Dagupan Railroad in 1892. You can read it. I've never seen a question on it. The next one, founding of the Katipunan in July 7, 1892. Andres Bonifacio and Ladislas Diwa and Teodoro Plata composed the first triangle of the secret society. Now, if you look at the Philippines flag, uh, of course, it is rectangular, so you have the two colors, which one is for the blood, the red. And if you look on the left-hand side, there's a triangle. That's the flag of the Kapitinan. You will not be questioned on this, but you have to remember when it was founded. The Katipunan was founded on July 7, 1892 by Bonifacio, by Diwa, and by Plata. Following one, exile of Dr. Rizal on July 17, 1892. Rizal arrived in Dapitan to serve as exile. This agitated many Filipinos to fight the Spanish colonial government. The hero contributed much to the development of Dapitan during his exile. You have to remember when he was deported. Rizal was deported in 1892. Discovery of the Katipunan on August 19, 1892. Its discovery led to the government crackdown on suspected members and Bonifacio immediate declaration of war against the Spanish government. So to me, as a foreigner, I'm not telling you what to believe or whatever. To me, your real national hero in terms of independence is Bonifacio. Long, long before Aguinaldo proclaimed independence, Bonifacio was actually fighting the Spaniards for it, way ahead of Aguinaldo. So I have not a problem with Aguinaldo. I mean, you choose your national heroes the way you want. But when I read, the more I read, the more I question, is the history reflect reality? No, sometimes we go with folklore. I said it a bit folkloric, but it is what it is. The other one you have to know also, the cry of Puga Lawen on August 23, 1892. The Katipuneros gathered in Puga Lawen, tore the cedulars, and declared war against Spain. So you have your identity, your cedula. You had to wear this because you were conquered for the Spaniard. This was your identity as a conquered person. So they tore it, and it became your cry for independence from Spain. And you declare war against Spain. So that's in 1892. That's way before Aguinaldo again. The Battle of Pinaglabanan. Sorry if I don't pronounce the names good. I'm French, so these names are a little bit strange to me. I do the best I can. So the Battle of Pinaglabanan, August 31, 1896, the first battle between the Katipuneros and Spanish forces in I cannot, uh, in San Juan Rizal. Over 100 Katipuneros were killed. Battle of Zapote Bridge, February 1897, is one of the major battles of the Philippine Revolution. I've seen it one time. It might be something that you want to highlight. The Tejeros Convention on March 22, 1897, the Tiquipuneros belonging to the Magdalo and Magdiwan councils changed the Katipunan into a revolutionary government and elected its officers. Subsequent events resulted in the execution of Bonifacio at Maragondon. So Bonifacio was there, and that became a point where actually Jose Rizal was against violence. He was against using violence against the Spaniards. He was more for the Philippines becoming a province of Spain. It might sound strange nowadays to say this, but a few years back, President Duterte publicly said he would not oppose being a province of China. So it was the same thing for Rizal. So Bonifacio was executed because he was part of a revolutionary government. The Acta de Heteros in March 1897, Bonifacio nullified the result of the election during the Tejeros Convention. The Naik Military Agreement, April 1897, Bonifacio signed this document declaring the results of the election during the Tejeros Convention null and void and established its own army separate of the Revolutionary Army formed during the convention. So at the convention, everybody decided they would have a military and a revolutionary army, and Bonifacio said no. And he formed his own military. So there was an inner dispute within Filipinos. Um, and this led to eventually Bonifacio being captured and being executed. The next one you really need to remember. The Pact of Bayak Nabato, December 14, 1897, signed by the Spanish government and the Filipino revolutionary leaders. This provided for the cessation of hostilities between the two parties and the voluntary exile of revolutionary leaders in Hong Kong or to Hong Kong. So, cessation of hostilities, it means stop fighting. So there was an agreement. You were still conquered by the Spaniards, but there was an agreement saying we stop fighting. And the ones that raised against the Spaniards, they were not forgiven and they were not captured or executed, but they were extradited to Hong Kong. So even though they were born and raised in the Philippines, um, the Spanish government could do whatever they want with them. Uprising of Leon Kiltat in Cebu, 1898. Leon Kilat, or Pantaleon Villegas, led the uprising against the Spaniards in Cebu, which was suppressed after a week with the arrival of reinforcements from Iloilo and Manila. And he continued his cause for many years. Now, the other part is the beginning, actually, of your independence, according to me. And as we go on, it's going to make sense. The Battle of Manila Bay in 1898, the American naval fleet led by George Dewey, you have to remember that, fought against the Spaniards' fleet under General Patrocinio Montojo. This signaled American colonization of the Philippines. The last line, this signaled America's colonization of the Philippines. 1898, in your culture, in your country, it says independence. It's not true. The Spaniards were kicked out and colonization by the Americans happened. So you weren't independent. You had a cry for independence, you had a wish for independence, but the fact is you were not independent. But remember the Battle of Manila Bay, it happens at the exam sometimes. Next one is extremely important. This one you have to know. Proclamation of Philippine Independence on June 12, 1898. General Emilio Aguinaldo proclaimed Philippines independence in Kawit, Cavite. This place you have to remember. Where did Aguinaldo declare independence? It's in Kawit, Cavite. During the event, Marcha Nacional Filipina, what would become the national anthem composed by Julian Felipe. Again, what's your national anthem and who composed it and what's the name of it? Marcha Nacional Filipina. National anthem, Juan Felipe, Julian Felipe, was played by the band of San Francisco de Malabon and the Philippine national flag was hoisted in public. I see this very often at the exam. Who first played the national anthem? And it's a San Francisco de Malabon. Remember that. I'm not telling you what to remember. I'm telling you this is what I see at the exam. And my students go to the exam, they come back, they say, oh, Tito, we have these questions, these questions, these questions. So I accumulate them both in my brain and I keep notes of it. Bates Treaty Agreement, August 20, 1898, signed in Mindanao between U.S. Representative Bates and Filipino Muslim leader Raja Muda and other Filipinos and other Muslims there. So this agreement, the Bates Treaty, was simply to say that Muslims would not get involved in a war with the Americans. The Republic of Negros, November 5, 1898. I've never seen any question. Revolutionary forces under General Juan Anacleto Araneta proclaimed the Republic of Negros. The Cry of Santa Barbara, November 17, 1898. The revolutionaries led by General Martin Delgado waved the Filipino flag and established the revolutionary government in Iloilo. I've never seen a question about this, but that doesn't mean you should not know it. The following one you need to know. The Treaty of Paris, December 10, 1898. This was signed between the United States and Spain, ceding Spanish colonies. So it's not only the Philippines. Puerto Rico was another Spanish colony, including the Philippines, to America. The Americans received the right to colonize the Philippines after paying $20 million US. They received the right. Who gave the right? When you receive something, somebody needs to give it to you. So Spaniards conquered the Philippines, which they had no right to do, but they did it anyway because they were stronger and had better weapons than you did. And then the Americans kicked the Spaniards out of Spanish colonies, and they say they received the right. Receiving the right to conquer a country is doesn't go very well for me. So, but you have to remember December 10, 1898, the Treaty of Paris for $20 million. The Philippines was colonized by US. Benevolent assimilation of the Philippines in 1898, President William McKinley proclaimed this as there was nothing left to do with the Philippines after the Spanish-American War but to take it as a colony. You had no government. During the Spanish colonization, you never formed a government. You were not part of the government. The Spaniards basically were controlling everything. And I'm not pro-American. Canada and the US, we are neighbors. We are very good neighbors. But I am not American. We don't practice the same system of government. Canada is a British colony, and we chose to remain a colony while you chose to be independent. We chose to remain a British colony because there's a lot of benefits in it. Um, the Americans colonized you, and slowly, it took 50 years, and you became independent. I'm not saying the Americans were perfect. That's not what I'm saying. But at least there was a plan for you to eventually become independent. The next point, assassination of General Luna, June 5, 1899. General Luna and his aide, Colonel Roman, were assassinated by fellow revolutionaries in Cabanatuan, Nueva Ecija. This event is considered one of the tragedies of the revolution. I've seen this question once at the exam. So you might want to highlight it, you might want to read it and remember it. La Independencia newspaper published Jose Palma's poem on September 3, 1899. The poem became the lyrics of the Marcha Nacional Filipina of Juan Felipe, thereby completing a national anthem for the Philippines. On September 22, 1943, the Commonwealth government adopted the flag and as national symbols. So what's important to know here, La Independencia newspaper and Jose Palma's poem. So your national anthem was actually a poem written on September 3, 1899. And it became your national anthem. And in 1943, you were under a Commonwealth government. You were no longer under American control. A Commonwealth, you are shared responsibility between the Americans and Filipino. And I'll explain that as we go. But you can see in this paragraph that we are talking slowly about you becoming independent. Arrival of Presbyterian missionaries on April 21, 1899. They were the first group of Protestant missionaries to arrive and establish missions in the Philippines. They established the first Protestant university in the Philippines, Silliman University, in August 1901. You will be asked, it's oftentimes at the exam, who were the Thomasites? Thomasites were actually the first educators in the Philippines, the first people trained to be educators in the Philippines. The Spaniards basically prohibited long education for Filipinos. When the Americans came in, it was the beginning for you of receiving a proper education. And these are the Thomasites. They are not a religious foundation. They were soldiers trained to become teachers, and they were on the St. Thomas ship. They arrived in the Philippines on the St. Thomas, so they were called the Thomasites. So the other paragraph, Battle of Tirat Pass on December 1899. General Del Pilar died in action while defending Tirat Pass from the American soldiers. You need to know that. Tirat Pass is sometimes at the exam. Balangiga Massacre, September 28, 1890. About 180 Filipino attacked 72 American soldiers and killed many of them. Soon after, the Americans retaliated by killing every Filipino who refused to surrender and were capable of carrying arms, including 10-year-old boys. America's pacification policy turned Samar into a howling wilderness. I don't have an opinion about this. I've never seen a question at the exam, but there could be about the Balangiga massacre. Capture of General Aguinaldo in Palanan, Isabela on March 23, 1901. The American colonial government considered this the end of the revolution. So your independence that Aguinaldo declared was the end. Aguinaldo was captured and he forever remained silent afterwards. Um, to say that your independence started in 1898, it's a little bit, it's folklore. It's folklore at best. The fact that Aguinaldo proclaimed independence doesn't mean that you were independent. But that's the date that you have chosen as a society, as a community, as a country. That's the year you have chosen to say that you were liberated, you were free, and you were independent. Public education system in 1901. The Philippine Commission passed Act 74 providing for the public education system, which included the use of English as the medium of instruction, free primary education, and the normal school for the training of teachers. The Thomasites arrived in the Philippines to serve as teachers. The normal school on Taft Avenue in Manila is now known as the Philippines Normal University. So you are planning to go at the LET, take the LET. For your information, all the exams in the Philippines, um, especially the licensure examination for teacher, it's all done at the Philippines Normal University. They are the only ones writing the formal exam used by PRC. So as you can see, the Americans came in 1898 and 3 years later, and I'm not defending them, I'm just saying the fact. The Philippines Commission put in place an education system. It was not the best one. And instead of using a vernacular, they use English as a medium of instruction. One of the reasons for this is there's too many dialects in the Philippines. They could not have books in every dialect, number one. Number two, your primary language of instruction was Spanish. Of course, now that you were dominated by Americans, you needed to lose your Spanish language, which you did, because very rarely now will you see somebody speaking Spanish in the Philippines. But in the old days, everybody did. So at least the Americans established a system of education, a primary, so from grade 1 to grade 5, and it was free. And they brought in the Thomasites to serve as teachers. And there was the creation of a normal school, and which became the Philippines Normal University. Anti-Sedition Law, October 1, 1901, the American colonial government passed Act 292 to quell armed nationalist sentiments during the era. So anybody that were uprising and asking again for independence, the Americans passed an act and soldiers were used to quell anybody that asked for freedom. Founding of Union Obrero Democrática in 1902. The first labor federation in the country was established at Teatro Variedades in San Polo, Manila, with Isabelo de los Reyes as president and Cruz as secretary. The organization celebrated Labor Day the following years. This you have to remember, Union Obrero Democrática. It is oftentimes at the exam. Uh, anyway, please highlight it. Establishment of a civil government in 1902, the U.S. Congress signed the Cooper Bill. Remember, Cooper Bill provided for the establishment of a civil government in the Philippines. Big change. 1898, you were under a military government. 4 years later, a civil government. So it's no longer soldiers and generals and, um, governing you. It was civilians. So people specialize in administration. Believe it or not, that was the beginning of your freedom. Iglesia Filipina Independencia, Philippines Independent Church, August 3. You can read it if you want. I never seen any question on this, but it could be. I've seen the name Gregorio Aglipay as the first bishop. Uh, you can study it. Manila Electric Railway, Pensionado Law. So this you have to know. Pensionado Law on August 27, 1903. Act 854 provided for scholarship for Filipino students to universities in the United States and their return to the Philippines to serve in different fields, including government. So Filipino good students were sent to universities in America um, to study, and when you came back, you worked for a government or large corporation. It was, it sounds simple nowadays when we look back, but in those days, this was new. This was reform. This was starting to give you some decision making power, some involvement in the decision making. I see this as favorable. I'm not saying that I like Americans. Of course, they took your money and stuff. They implemented their culture, and you still admire American culture. But to me, that was a step ahead in the sense that this was leading to eventually being independent. The first Labor Day rally in the Philippines, May 1, 1903, organized by Union Obrero Democrática de Filipinas. As I said before, you have to remember the first union, Union Obrero Democrática. Philippine Constabulary School, February 1905, it was first established at Santa Lucia Barracks in Intramuros. Then it was transferred in 1908 to Baguio City as the Philippine Military Academy and developed into a premier military school. Now, the other point is very, very important. Inauguration of the first Philippine Assembly, October 16, 1907. It served as the lower house of a bicameral legislature with the Philippine Commission as the upper house. Later on, in your review, you will have a lecture on the Philippines Constitution and your form of government. So your form of government is bicameral. You have the lower house, upper house. You have the Congress and you have the executive. So it's always two. And I will explain that longer when we do the Constitution. It's pretty interesting to me. It doesn't mean it would be to you. But the inauguration of the first Philippine Assembly in 1907, it was not the American Assembly, it was the Philippines Assembly. Again, another favorable move towards independence. Creation of University of the Philippines in June 1908. The country's premier state university was created by Act in 1870. So that was under the Spanish rule, but it came in place under the American rule in 1908. So you had your own university. Good thing. It could be at the exam. I don't remember seeing a question, but there might be. First court case of libel, October 30, 1908. El Renacimiento published in its editorial Aves de Rapina, Birds of Prey, about a man who preyed on his enemies the way an eagle, vulture, owl, and a vampire do. American Secretary of the Interior, Dean Worcester, felt alluded to, so he felt that uh, he was depicted uh, as the vulture to an article and sued the paper editor and publisher Teodoro Cala and Martin Ocampo. Worcester won the case and the newspaper was closed. Iglesia Evangelica Metodista en las Islas Filipinas, February 28, 1909. You can read about it. Iglesia Ni Cristo in 1914. It's an indigenous church founded by Felix Manalo. Its leaders are often wooed by politicians who are aware of the church's tendency to vote by bloc. What does that mean is even nowadays politicians tend to go see church leaders to get their support. Iglesia Ni Cristo is very famous for this. If the leaders say vote for this person, most of the members of the church will vote for that person. So you vote in block. You don't vote according to your conscience or your choice. You vote as told by the leaders of the of the church. Founding of Congreso Obrero de Filipinas, May 1, 1913, organized by Cruz. The organization battled for an 8-hour working day, abolition of child labor, just labor standards for women, and liability of capitalists. I've never seen a question on this, but it's an important fact. Flag Day, October 31, 1919, proclaimed by National Assembly. You might want to remember that. National Federation of Women's Club, 1921. You can read about that. I've never seen a question, but please learn your history. Radio station, June 1922. First servants Manila and Pasay before they expanded to the provinces. Most stations were confiscated by the Japanese during the war. Communist Party of the Philippines, which is still present today, August 27, 1930. Crisanto Evangelista established the party, which later merged with the Socialist Party of Pedro Abad Santos and composed Ugbalahap during the Second World War. The government declared it illegal, and to this day it is illegal. The next one you need to know, inauguration of Rizal Monument, December 29, 1930. The Rizal Monument to Rizal was inaugurated at the Luneta Park, which is now Rizal Park. Sagdalista movement in 1931, underground socialist reform movement whose members were mostly peasants, and the anti-nationalist policies of the government. Okay, beginning of your independence. And this is oftentimes at the exam. When I tell you oftentimes, I will say this 100 times here. You have to remember this. You have to remember this. That may be worth only 1 point at the exam. And I'm insisting that you know all of this. My last exam, January 2022, until now, I have 5 students, 5, that finished at 74, 74.8, 74.2. They were within one answer of passing their exam and forever being finished with it. Instead, they are now repeaters. If you're a repeater, you know what I'm talking about. Each question is important. So please, when I say remember this, make a conscious effort after the lecture, during evening, during weekend, read your reviewer. It's important, okay? Tidings-McDuffie, Tidings-McDuffie Law, March 25, 1934. This law, signed by Theodore Roosevelt, which was the president of the U.S., provided for the establishment of the transition period before America would eventually recognize Philippine independence. So Tidings and McDuffie were 2 U.S. senators that were sent to the Philippines to study if and report back to the president and Congress, the American Congress, about the independence of the Philippines. So the Americans could not be in the Philippines and one day just leave and say, you manage on your own. The country would have just crushed. So they submitted a report that was signed by Theodore Roosevelt, President of the US, saying 1934 to 1944, you would be under a Commonwealth government. What does that mean? Commonwealth government. It's a big word. It's actually a British way of managing Commonwealth. It means sharing the wealth and sharing the responsibility. So progressively, for 10 years, you will be given more and more responsibilities. And for your own information, the last department to be given to the Philippines government to manage, the last department, the most important department, was the Department of Education. It's big, it's large, it's important, it has huge impact, it has a huge budget. It is the last that was given to the Philippines. So 1934, Tading McDuffie, you have to remember that. That's 100%. It's at the exam every year, either March or September. I don't know when if you will get it, but you will have question. You will see this Tiding McDuffie. You have to know what it's all about. Inauguration of the Commonwealth Government, November 15, 1935. Manuel Quezon and Sergio Osmeña took the oath as president and vice president. So in 1934, Tiding McDuffie said, let's have a Commonwealth government, and we will start in 1935, and it started. Quezon was never elected. He was chosen by the Americans and Osmeña also to be president and vice president. Commonwealth Constitution of 1935 used to guide the Commonwealth. It was cut off during the Japanese period, and it was restored after the war until 1973 when President Marcos ratified a new one. So what happened is in 1935 until 1945, you were supposed to be under the Commonwealth. In 1945, you were to have elections and elect your own government. And because the Japanese attacked the Philippines, everything was delayed by 1 year. So your um, independence actually came in 1946. July 4, 1946. Why July 4? Because the Americans decided that their Independence Day is July 4 also. And they decided that they will give you your independence while they celebrated theirs. Of course, your president did not like that and changed it to June 12. Why June 12? Because June 12, 1898, that's when Aguinaldo proclaimed the Philippines as independent. Change page. Law on women's suffrage, so women were allowed to vote in 1937. For the first time, Filipino women were given the right to vote during the election. Actually, you were precursors. Precursors, you were very advanced. Women in Canada were only allowed to vote in 1939. So in the Philippines, you were 2 years ahead of us. Japanese invasion, December 8, 1941. Japanese bombers attacked Clark Air Base and other American camps in Baguio City, Manila, and Davao. This signaled the beginning of the Japanese occupation of the Philippines. Oath taking at Malinta Tunnel Corridor, December 30, 1941. Manuel Quezon took his second term of his office as president of the Commonwealth government. New government under Japanese um, December 3, 1942, the Kapisanan sa Paglilingkod, I cannot pronounce it, sa Bagong Pilipinas, very long, was established and elected OZP Laurel as president of the Philippines. So basically a puppet government chosen by the Japanese. This party, however, lasted only until 1945. Tagalog as official language, June 7, 1940. President Quezon proclaimed Tagalog as one of the official languages of the Philippines starting July 4, 1946. You have the date there. That's the date you became independent, July 4, 1946. And Quezon said Tagalog is one of the official languages, English being the other one. Why English? You had no books printed in your own language. And to this day, your school books, if I discuss high school, college, university, or any kind of institute, all in English. Why are they not in Tagalog if Tagalog is your official language? If you want to go ahead in the world, you need to speak English. One of the biggest money-making scheme in the Philippines is your overseas foreign workers. This is your main export in the Philippines is your overseas foreign workers, your labor force. And they only go out to the Philippines for one reason only, if they can speak English. If you did not speak English, you would be stuck in the Philippines. This can be said the same for India. India was conquered and was managed by Britain. To this day, education is in English, the books are in English. And India is competing with the Philippines for labor, so overseeing foreign workers. Fall of Manila in 1942, the Japanese basically conquered Manila. Fall of Bataan on April 9, 1942, General King surrendered to spread the lies of battle-weary and outnumbered Filipino and American soldiers who were defending Bataan. They ran out of ammunition and supply and no reinforcement. Fall of Corregidor, General Wainwright surrendered the entire United States Army in the Philippines to General Homa of the Japanese Imperial Army. General MacArthur was on a boat, ended up in Australia, but had said, I shall return. Leyte Landing, beginning of the end of Japanese occupation. Leyte Landing on October 20, 1944, General MacArthur landed in Leyte Gulf with Sergio Osmeña Sr. and Carlos Romulo. This signaled the retaking of the Philippines from the Japanese soldiers. It was also a fulfillment of MacArthur's promise in 1942 when he said, I shall return. Osmeña succeeded Quezon as president of the Philippines on August 1, 1944. President Quezon died of tuberculosis while he was in the United States. Makabayang, Katipunan ng Pilipino, Makapili, December 8, 1944. The Japanese used its members composed of Filipinos to inform on guerrilla sympathizer. Many of its members were persecuted after the war for the atrocities they committed against the people. So Filipinos against Filipinos, they were paid, they were rewarded by Japanese, and when they were caught after the war, they were executed or prosecuted. Establishment of the Congress of Labor, March 16, 1945, the CLO, first called Committee of Labor Organization, was a federation of labor organization organized by former leaders of the Ugbo Nakbayan Laban, which was forced to go underground when the government declared it illegal. Liberation of Manila in 1945. The Americans entered Manila and liberated many Filipino-American internees, especially in Intramuros, at the University of Santo Tomas. Manila was devastated after the war. Basically, Manila was flattened. It was bombarded. General MacArthur turned over the civilian government to Osmeña. United Nations membership, September 1945. So you became independent in 1946, but the Americans had kicked the Japanese out in 1945, and you joined the United Nations. This means that you were already recognized as an independent country. So sometimes I have some problems when I hear your current president saying American this, American that, and this and that, and this and that, considering that there's 4 million Filipinos or descendant of Filipinos in the US, that they gave you your independence. Yeah, they took some of your money, some of your power, some of your basic resources, but you became a country because of them, not because of the Spaniards. They gave you a form of government. It's not the perfect government, but they gave you something. Philippine independence from America, July 4th, 1946. America eventually let go of the Philippines. Alto Broadcasting Network, the first commercial television. Death of President Ramon Magsaysay. In 1957, the president plane crash in Cebu. His death grieved the Filipino and caused immediate transition of leadership in government. From what I read, Magsaysay was probably the best president you ever had. I never read anything about corruption. I never read anything bad. He was for the advancement of Filipino culture. He was a man of the people, for the people. You might think otherwise, but that's what I read. Re-establishment of the Communist Party of the Philippines in 1968. Okay, so now we enter the probably the worst part of your history here. Martial laws, September 21, 1972. Remember that. Remember that. 1972 martial law. Marcos signed Proclamation 1081. Remember that number, Proclamation 1081, declaring martial law to save the Republic from crime and violence. Marcos abolished the Congress, so no more senators, no more representatives, and created the semi-parliament Batasan Pambasa. It caused a takeover of many private businesses by the government, exile, disappearance, and imprisonment of the individual critical of the government. So we're talking about the father of Bongbong Marcos here. Martial Law 1972, Proclamation 1081, and Marcos. I was a young boy. I was a teenager when this happened. Assassination of Senator Ninoy Aquino in 1983 at the airport, and the airport was eventually named after him. Compelec employees, I remember this, walked out on February 9, 1986. 30 computer technicians of the Commission on Elections walked out of their jobs after they were ordered to cheat the election return in favor of President Marcos. So the people, the uprising, the first EDSA uprising, actually started at Comelec. It was the first time that somebody was saying no to Marcos. So very brave man to do this. Military mutiny on February 1986, Defense Minister Ponce Enrile and Air Force Fidel Ramos, General Chief of Staff Fidel Ramos, defected from the Marcos administration. People gathered at EDSA to protect them from pro-administration soldiers. 2 days after President Marcos went in exile to Hawaii, the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency of the USA, took him and brought him to Hawaii. Oath-taking of Corazon Aquino, the senator's widow, and Salvador Laurel as president, vice president in the Philippines in 1946. They were elected after a snap election. Return of presidential government in 1987. President Aquino appointed 48 members of the Constitutional Convention to draft a constitution that restored democracy and abolished the Patasan Pambansa. Okay, that's a little bit limited. You need to know it. In 1986, Marcos is flown out. Aquino is named president. From 1986 to 1987, your current constitution was signed in 1987. So what happened? You still had the 1973 and 1981 constitution there, and it needed to be reformed because it was addressing martial law and not full liberty. So she formed a group of 48 members, a constitutional convention. They wrote a new constitution. It was a suggestion, a wish list, and when you had election, a snap election, it was also a plebiscite, which means a vote for her was a vote for the Constitution also. So it's called a plebiscite. Um, so your current Constitution, you have to remember this. It might be at the exam. The Constitution of 2022 in the Philippines was actually signed in 1987 under President Aquino presidency. Military coup in 87. You can read about this. I've never seen a question at the exam. Inauguration of Fidel Ramos and Vice President Estrada in 1992. President Ramos and Vice President Estrada were sworn in by Chief Justice Andres Narpasa. Um, in my life, President Ramos was your best president. I never heard any corruption, any womanizing, any investment, money missing or whatever. He worked with the Muslim. He signed agreements with the Muslim to try to bring peace in the region. And he was asked by President Aquino to run as president. And he agreed for the benefit of the Philippines. And when he retired, he basically disappeared. A very quiet man, very well educated. He was educated in West Point in the USA. Um, remember this. Biggest case of corruption in 1993, former First Lady Imelda Marcos was convicted for the first time of corruption and sentenced to 24 years in prison. Few days earlier, the remains of President Marcos, who died in 1989 in Hawaii, was finally entombed at their family mausoleum in Patak, Ilocos Sur. And we're coming to the end. First actor, President of the Philippines, 1998, Estrada, best known as Zira, took his oath, and 13th President of the Philippines, and the 20th Century and Millennium Watch in year 2000, the Filipino nation, led by Estrada, joined the whole world welcoming the millennium. The president called on Filipinos to pray for global peace and brotherhood and to work as one in facing the challenge of the 21st century. While there's more to be said about this, Estrada is the first president to be kicked out, and he is the first president to be found guilty in the court of law of graft, so basically corruption for money. Um, and then he was pardoned by President Arroyo. So if you're rich, you can steal money, and the next president will pardon you. It's not a president for the people. One of the good things that happened, and you see this occasionally at the exam, one of the good things that happened under President Marcos' presidency is the miracle rice. Before the miracle rice, your rice plantations were losing large amount of crops. So you did not have a high yielding compared to other Asian countries like Thailand, for instance, or Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, or China. They have high yielding rice. And Marcos did travel quite a bit during his presidency, and he visited a place and they explained the kind of rice they were using, and he kind of forcibly brought that rice in the Philippines. So it needs less water, it's more resistant to insects, it's a good crop and high yielding, and is better for a better health also. So it's probably the only thing favorable you're going to hear me say about him, but it needs to be said. So this lecture ends with President Estrada. After Estrada, I think you are old enough to know what's happening in your contemporary history. Um, I hope this lecture will help you. The reviewer will help you. I have two more reviewers. We're going to do a lot of questions in writing. We're going to do a lot of questions on television, on videos. And this is where you will learn. If there is a question that is asked and you don't know the answer, please find it. Find it and know why is the answer. Don't try memorization. Say, oh, I will remember the answer. I will remember this. I will remember that. It's not true. It does not work like this. You have to know why. And question number A, the answer is C. Um, who was president of the Philippines in 1986? Who took the presidency of the Philippines in 1986? You have to know that it's President Aquino. And you have to know why. It's after the EDSA revolution. It's after her husband was shot at the airport, at the Manila airport, and he was a senator that ran away because Marcos, he was anti-Marcos. He came back and he was sitting in the plane when a journalist, a foreign journalist, talking to him about coming back in the Philippines, and he said, I would be surprised if I make it down to the tarmac. The tarmac is the pavement of the airport. And he predicted his own death. He said, I would be surprised if I make it down to the tarmac. He did not. He was shot while going down the stairs from the airplane. There's actually a video of that. If you want to see it, write me and I will give it to you. So I enjoyed this lecture. It's a little boring. It's a little bit long. It's an hour and 11 minutes right now. But if it's for your own benefits, you can replay it, you can um, save it on your phone, you can save it on your computer. Everything that I said you need to remember, please do. This is serious. I want you to pass. I don't do this for the money. I'm not CBRC or Maglente. I'm not a historian. I base my knowledge on past exams and students of mine that went to the exam and report back. Um, I ask you to please, 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 please take it seriously. Okay, I want you to pass. I want you to be successful. I want you to be LPT. In every lecture, you're gonna help me. You're gonna hear me say this, and I really mean it. Tita and me are trying to keep our prices low. We used to do it for free. We can no longer do this. All these lectures take a lot of time. The reviewer took me years to prepare. I don't sell it to anybody. I used to give it away. I can't afford to do that anymore. Anyway, I wish you good luck. We're going to have several of these lectures. They're all super important. For instance, a lecture on math. We're going to have that. We're going to have a constitution and all the aspects of English. So the stanzas, the sonnets, um, the grammar. We're going to do that. And especially prophet. And all the components of profit. Okay, enjoy your day. You're going to have exams about Philippine history. I will organize this. So good luck and see you during our next lecture.